Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I'm the chair of the New Urbanism Division of APA, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, September 7th. We will be hearing the presentation, Foreign Trade Zones and Trump Tariffs, Options for Local Economic Developers. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number shown. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, type those in that questions box located on the right of your screen, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And if your question is for a particular panelist, please state so when you are typing in your question. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2018. Thanks to all those sponsoring for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we just ask that you reach out to them and suggest that they join us. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the Economic Development Division of APA, and you can learn about them and all the divisions that we have to offer at planning.org/divisions. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education credit, and you can check out all those details on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. To log today's CM credits, just head over to planning.org and log into your My APA account. Then under the CM log, you can search for CM activities, either by the title of today's webcast or by the event number, both of which of those can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. And we are recording today's webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel at the conclusion of the session. Just head over to YouTube and search Planning Webcast, and we'll pop up along with our over 200 webcasts that are available for viewing. And we will have a PDF available of the session also, again, at the end of the session today. And it will be available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay, I'm done with that. I am going to turn it over to today's speakers. First up is Sean Maguire. Sean, don't forget to unmute yourself. And I am passing the baton over to you.
All right. Hey, great. Thanks so much. I really appreciate all you've done to help get this webinar organized today. Give me a minute here while I get my screen up and running so you can see what's going on, and I believe we should be all set now. So thanks for joining us today. My name is Sean Maguire. I'm the webinar coordinator for the Economic Development Division. I've also have the pleasure of being your moderator and speaker today. You know, when it comes to the trade economy, we're not necessarily in uncharted waters. You know, in fact, it was back in the 1930s that we faced a similar challenge. The Tariff Act of 1930, known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariffs, has been cited as a major factor in the reduction of American exports and imports before the Great Depression. And in response to these protectionist tariffs, Congress passed the Foreign Trade Zones Act of 1934 to, quote, expedite and encourage foreign commerce in the United States to mitigate the negative effects of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. In 2018, the U.S. is once again faced with protectionist tariffs, but levied by the president through powers granted to his office through the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974. So could the foreign trade zone once again provide a safe harbor from tariffs for U.S. companies that rely on foreign components? And how can planners and economic developers use the foreign trade zone program to assist businesses and communities facing these issues and challenges? The other presenters joining me today are practicing economic development professionals and foreign trade zone professionals with direct experience managing, marketing, and supporting foreign trade zone programs across the United States. So I'm really pleased to introduce today's panel, I've mentioned who I am. Again, I'm the Director of Economic Development and Data Services for the Capital District Regional Planning Commission, based in the heart of it all, Albany, New York here. I'm also the Director of the Capital Region Foreign Trade Zone. I'm a past Section Director for the Capital District section of the APA and current Vice President of the New York Upstate Chapter. Also joining me tonight are two really good friends of mine, Angie Atwood and Isaac Barrow. Angie is the Foreign Trade Zone Program Manager for the Columbus Regional Airport Authority, grantee of Foreign Trade Zone number 138. During Angie's years with the Airport Authority, she has acquired the in-depth knowledge and skills required to manage the administration and marketing of Foreign Trade Zone 138's 25 county service area. Angie has been a member of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones since 1999 and is a very active member and past chair of the Grantee Committee. She's also serving her second term on the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones Board of Directors. Angie has a bachelor's degree in business education from Ball State University and is also an accredited zone specialist. The AZS is actually NAFTZ's, equivalency of AICP to us here as planners. Also joining us from the West Coast is my friend Isaac Barrow. Isaac is a world citizen and a service-oriented leader, passionate about inclusive community building through economic growth. In his economic development role, he engages in holistic and partnership-based strategies to recruit and retain quality employers. In his previous role as the business development manager at the Port of Portland, Isaac has completed numerous real estate development transactions, representing over $100 million in investment to the region. Under his management, Foreign Trade Zone number 45 grew from 500 employees to 3,500 employees and from $500 million in traded goods to well over $3.1 billion in traded goods. Isaac's fluent in French and has spent a large portion of his life overseas in the developing world. He knows that sustainable and equitable growth is key to ensuring a prosperous and inclusive future, and weaves core values of justice, unity, and sustainability into his work, service, and play. He's earned the CM designation from the American Association of Airport Executives. He's been certified as a Portland ambassador by Greater Portland, and is a certified commercial pilot and flight instructor, though his flying is mostly just for fun these days. Isaac is a graduate of Portland State University with a business degree in management and marketing. So glad to have Angie and Isaac with me today. So let's just give you a quick overview of where we're going in this webinar. I'm going to step up to the plate first and give you a background and overview of the Foreign Trade Zone program here in the US. Angie will then jump in and talk about how foreign trade zones benefit US businesses, how the incentives and the options work to their benefit. And wrapping it up is Isaac, who's going to talk about the process of designating a foreign trade zone. Once we get through that, we'll have some time for questions and answers. You'll be able to submit those right through the webinar system here. So again, I'm going to talk about the background and overview of foreign trade zones. I really want to be able to set the stage for what a foreign trade zone is, why they're important, and how the current trade environment may cause you to revisit the foreign trade zone program that maybe you've heard about but never have taken advantage of. But I think first what we need to do is sort of set the stage here and throw out some terms that we're going to kick around here. Duties and tariffs is one that people often ask us, well, what's the difference between them? Because they're often used interchangeably. And so in this presentation, we may do that. But just to give you an idea what they mean at their core, duty is the tax that's paid on an import. That's collected by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and that's based on a tariff schedule. That's the schedule of duties imposed. That's what the tariff represents. Now, the ability to enact tariffs lies specifically with the Congress, specifically with the House, and that's empowered by the U.S. Constitution through what you're probably familiar with, which is the power of the purse. That's what Congress has. But the Constitution also reserves the ability to negotiate treaties with the executive branch and with the president. And so the president does have the ability to negotiate trade agreements as a result. And understanding this relationship will help you understand how some of these trade acts work and how they come into play here. But the president alone does not have the ability to set duties and tariffs, doesn't have the ability to simply unilaterally decide to impose a tariff and duty. However, Congress, through some trade acts, has provided the president with some limited abilities to take certain actions in trade. And those are two of the trade acts that I referenced when we first got started here. So you'll probably recall that during the last presidential campaign, President Trump, well, then candidate Donald Trump, raised concern with a $500 billion trade deficit. Moving forward into 2018, the president started to exercise his authority to take certain actions on trade, which were authorized by key acts. Again, because the president can't unilaterally make a decision to impose a tariff, any action that he does take regarding tariffs has to be explicitly authorized by Congress. And there's two key acts where that occurs. The first one is the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. And in Section 232 specifically, the act allows the president to impose tariffs based on threats to national security. We've seen that applied to imports of steel and aluminum into the United States back in March of 2018. There have been some exceptions to that Section 232 tariff based on negotiations with individual countries. But places like China are still feeling that impact, places like Canada as well. Jumping forward about 12 years, we get to the Trade Act of 1974. There's two key provisions in that the current administration has referenced and utilized to address some of its concerns with the trade imbalance. First is Section 201 of the Trade Act, which calls for the investigation, allows for the investigation of domestic industries' claims of injury or threat of injury due to expanding imports. If you saw the actions that were taken against imports of washing machines and solar panels back in January, earlier part of this year, that was a Section 201 action. And that was in the case of washing machines, for example. I believe that was initiated by Whirlpool as a concern of, for example, the imports of Korean washing machines. Section 301 is the other section of the Trade Act that applies here, and that's designed to eliminate unfair foreign trade practices that adversely affect the United States. We're talking about practices that include dumping by a foreign nation deliberately directing a significant number of exports for their country into the United States can sometimes be seen as a threat to the overall trade ecosystem. And so in this case, the Section 301 actions that were taken this year, we've seen that mostly apply to Chinese goods starting back in March of 2018. And so considering those existing conditions that we've seen over the course of this year, we in the foreign trade zone community have seen a greater interest in the foreign trade zone program. Now, people may be familiar with the term, but aren't always familiar with the ins and outs. And while we're not going to get exactly up to bringing you to the level of foreign trade zone expert, I think that by the end of this presentation, you'll have a very good awareness of how the program works. And again, going back to the initial slides, the foreign trade zones were a creation of the Foreign Trade Zones Act of 1934, as in, again, response to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and its goal was to maintain and create jobs and investment in the United States. The first foreign trade zone was then established in 1937 in New York City, down in Staten Island. Today, all 50 states across the United States, including Puerto Rico, have established foreign trade zones. More than 3,000 companies, 3,300 companies, use foreign trade zones in one manner or the other. They don't always use them in the same exact manner. Some companies have different reasons for implementing a foreign trade zone, whether it be supply chain considerations, financial incentives, or so on. But there's quite a great participation across the country. Approximately 420,000 people are employed at facilities operating with foreign trade zone status, and that reflects over $610 billion in annual trade activity. Exports from the foreign trade zone are over $76 billion. The foreign trade zone program has actually a really impressive track record. And when you look back to the Obama administration, in fact, some of the challenges that the president had issued at that time in terms of increasing exports, the foreign trade zone program, exports from foreign trade zones, outperformed the goals established by the prior administration. And so we've got some good history of success there. So who are the players? Who are the ones that you need to know? Who should be in the program here? Well, there's really three key external players in Washington. First is the Foreign Trade Zones Board. The Foreign Trade Zones Board is made up of only two members, the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Treasury. These officials are empowered to issue appropriate applicants the grant of authority to establish, maintain, or operate foreign trade zone projects. And that's why when we talk about the local foreign trade zone program, often refer to them as grantees because they possess that grant of authority, and that has to come from the Foreign Trade Zones Board specifically. The Foreign Trade Zones Board staff is, well, like any place probably where most of the day-to-day work is being accomplished, and those are officials in the Department of Commerce, specifically in the International Trade Administration, and that team is responsible for overseeing the administration of the foreign trade zones, and the Executive Secretary heads up this office. The Executive Secretary also is the principal staff to the Foreign Trade Zones Board. And while the Foreign Trade Zones Board can establish a lot of actions, really the folks that are responsible for the security and integrity of imports into the U.S. is Customs and Border Protection. The port director in the local community is the first point of contact for that. The port director is the customs official that has responsibility for overseeing the activation and operation of zone projects within his customs port of entry. And I think Angie will cover that a little bit more later. And if we have more questions about that, please use that chat box to ask those questions. The grantee, as I mentioned before, that's the entity who has the privilege of operating, establishing, operating, and maintaining a foreign trade zone in an area. Operators and users are the ones that are benefiting from the use of the foreign trade zone. An operator is an entity that operates a zone or a subzone under the terms of an agreement with the grantee. And the user is using a zone or a subzone for storage, handling, or processing of merchandise. And in some cases, sometimes the user and the operator are the same entity. So one of the things that we do in the foreign trade zone community with our economic development partners is try to help them better understand and identify potential candidates that would benefit from the use of a foreign trade zone. And I like to say to my partners that the minute you hear that a business is engaged in importing, let that be a signal to you that perhaps a foreign trade zone might be beneficial to their operations. Realistically, what we do as a grantee is that we'll take a look at the potential lead, the potential candidate, and try to identify what their potential annual savings are for using a foreign trade zone. Certainly savings of a couple $1,000s has proven to us to be unlikely to suggest that the implementation of a foreign trade zone will have significant benefit. But what we look for is savings anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 through the use of the foreign trade zone to initially cover the cost of implementing the FTZ, and then certainly savings above and beyond that to continue to benefit the business using the zone. One of the challenges that we find is that initial implementation can seem like a huge hurdle to overcome, but we find that change can be beneficial in the long run. There's a lot of benefits to the implementation of a foreign trade zone. So with that, I hope I've given you a good overview on what the foreign trade zone program is. And so I'd like to have Angie here talk with you about the foreign trade zone benefits. Angie, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sean. Hello from Columbus, Ohio. So my first First slide, Sean. We're going to talk about the FTZ benefits. Number one and most important thing, and the number one question I ask anyone who inquires about the FTZ is, are you an importer? A company must import product in order to have savings, because this is a duty savings program. That's where you save when you import the products and pay that tax or duty. So there are three main duty savings benefits: deferral, reduction, or elimination. And two other benefits, one called direct delivery, the other weekly entry. Okay, next slide. Start with duty deferral here. So let's just back up a little bit to what Sean said. An FTZ is an area that's considered outside the U.S. for customs purposes. But your warehouse is still right here in Columbus, Ohio, or Albany, New York, or Portland, Oregon, or wherever. It is considered outside the U.S. So think about the supply chain and your goods coming in by ocean container to a port of entry. In a non-FTZ scenario, right then you would file your entry with U.S. Customs, and then 10 days later you would have to pay the duties, that are associated with those items, and the fees that are associated with processing the paperwork, those kinds of things. In an FTZ, you don't file your entry at that port, at your port of unlading. You file an FTZ document called a 214, and your goods are admitted. No duties are paid at that time, and no fees are paid on that paperwork. And your goods are moved in bond, still in foreign status, considered foreign merchandise, into your warehouse. Now, the way that duties are deferred is you don't pay those duties when the ship comes into the port. You pay the duties when the goods leave your warehouse to your customer. So if you have products that move a little more slowly, maybe you have something that can be in your inventory for 3 or 4 months. You're deferring that duty for as long as the item is there. There is no time limit on how long the goods can remain in the FTZ. So sometimes you can see, like, maybe a company who services machines may have to require a lot of parts, in stock, so that they could send them to their customers and fix their main machines. But maybe those parts, are from 20 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever, and can just remain there forever. You can mix foreign and domestically sourced merchandise. So if I get blue coffee cups from China and I get blue coffee cups from next door, I can put them in the same bin, as long as they're the same SKU number, and mix them. You can also manufacture, all the products in you'll hear more about this later, but all the products in all the parts that make up your final product do not have to be domestic or foreign. You can source as much as you can domestically and only buy the ones that you need to foreign. But an FTZ is a little bit more flexible like that. Next slide. Duty reduction. This is mainly in the manufacturing scenario, and it applies to manufacturing or assembly in the zone. In the foreign trade zone, it's called production, because really the test there is there's a classification called an HTS, and that's how you figure out what duty you have to pay for what product. So if that number changes, the HTS number changes of your product between your part, and I'll explain a little bit later, or upcoming, that is considered production. So if I put a light bulb, I'm importing light bulbs and I'm putting it in tanning beds, and what's actually leaving my FTZ is a tanning bed. It's not a light bulb anymore. So that would require an additional production authority from the Ftc board. I think Isaac will talk about the applications and those kinds of things later. But there is an extra step there. But here's the way duty reduction works. And I just like to do it. I'm a hands-on kind of person, so let's just do this example here. And this is true. Car radios have an 8% duty rate. Cars have a 2.5% duty rate. Radios are admitted into an Ftz. Remember, they're still foreign merchandise. But when the car is put together and manufactured, and that radio is put in the car, it becomes a part of the car. And what leaves the Ftz is actually the car, which is dutiable at 2.5%. This reduces the duty liability on each radio by 5.5%. Maybe it's only a $100 radio. It doesn't sound like a lot of money unless you're making 1 million cars, or that could be very significant. So that's the way that you can reduce. And radios are not the only part in a car that are more than 2.5%. So that's the way you can reduce your duty liability in a zone. Okay, next slide. And sometimes you can actually eliminate your duty. I'm in Columbus, Ohio, so a lot of the customers, the companies who are in my zone, Ftz 138, do this because they re-export a lot to Canada. And maybe Portland and Albany do the same thing. It's just 3 hours, so why have a Canadian warehouse? We can just re-export from here. What happens is, remember, the goods are in your warehouse and you haven't paid your duties. And then if you re-export it to anywhere, but let's just say for Canada, back out of the U.S., you never ever pay the duty associated with those items because they never entered the U.S. stream of commerce. This is, and number 2 on this slide, you can avoid applying for duty drawback. This is my number 2 question that I ask everybody. Are you an importer? And then number 2 is, are you doing duty drawback? Because if you know what that program is and you're doing it, you should probably look at the Ftz. What duty drawback is you pay your duties, and when you re-export the items, you can ask for your money back. I always say, why do that? Keep your money in your pocket. So it can be a very good cash savings or cash flow for a company if they're a heavy exporter. You can also avoid duties on any scrap or defective goods. So, this is broken or torn. I can destroy it in my zone with customs permission. And then I eat the cost of the product, but, I don't have to pay the duty on it. And in my zone, I have a lot of textiles, and they have a hefty duty rate, 17 to 23%. So if they have a delivery that's damaged, that can be significant for them sometimes. The exception here is if you sell your scrap, I do something with metal and I end up selling it, to recycle. You can't, if you sell it, you still have to pay the duty. So, next slide, please. So those are the 3 duty advantages to being in a zone: deferral, reduction, elimination. The next benefit is direct delivery. And basically, in a foreign trade zone anyway, without direct delivery, your goods don't stop in customs. So you could pick up a few days. You could save a few days in your supply chain. But with direct delivery, you could even get more advantages if you get a shipment that you don't know about. So, okay, you have to be pre-approved by U.S. Customs, okay? Your goods come into the port of entry, they know your direct delivery, so your goods just move automatically. But what happens if the ship comes in on Saturday and, I don't have my E-214 filed, and Customs doesn't know that this is supposed to be here? If you're pre-approved by direct delivery by U.S. Customs, your goods will move anyway. It sounds kind of weird, but I mean, it's a big security process to get approved for all this stuff, and you got to be a a reputable importer that's getting the same stuff from the same supplier over and over and over. So goods are you don't have any delays with customs, even on the weekends, even after hours. Your goods are delivered directly. I can get it on Saturday, and then file my paperwork on Monday with U.S. Customs when they open, and everything's kosher. It's still good then. So that is more of a speed thing, and all of my customers want that. Next slide, please. Weekly entry. Okay. Weekly entry is a way for companies to save money on the fees that they pay to customs every time you file an entry. There's a fee associated with that. Not only is there a brokerage fee for your customs broker to file that entry, there's a merchandise processing fee that U.S. Customs charges you. And they charge it based on the value of the goods in that shipment. So if I have approximately $144,000 in my shipment, I'm going to max out on my fees. The merchandise processing fees range from a minimum of $25 to a maximum of, I can't believe I'm saying this, $497.99. So, and it's 0.3464% of the value of the goods. So if you hit $144,000, if anybody knows math real well, you're going to max out at that $498 maximum fee you have to pay. Harbor maintenance, you can defer and pay it quarterly. It does also require pre-approval from customs. So now that I've confused you royally, I'm going to, next slide, I'll show you an example. This is, I got to see this stuff, so this will make more sense. Say I'm getting 4 shipments in Seattle, 10 shipments in LA, and I get 6 shipments in Norfolk. This is a week, so 20 shipments in a week. Next slide. In non-Ftz scenario, all 20 shipments are entered into the U.S. stream of commerce at the port of unlading. So in Seattle, LA, Norfolk. The broker will file 20 separate entries and charge you 20 separate fees to do that. Each of the 20 shipments are also subject to the merchandise processing fee, MPF payment. So I'm using $498 here. 20 shipments at $498 is $9,960 a week. And this is not a big shipper. This is not a big, I'd say this is mid-size. If you do $144,000, if you do this, 20 shipments a week, it's about $150 million company, mid-size. Okay, so next slide. In an Ftz scenario, when your goods are at the port of unlading, no consumption entries are filed. So the brokers aren't doing 20 entries and charging you 20 fees. No MPF is paid for each of those. In fact, remember, all of your goods are moved in bond, non-duty paid, to your warehouse, wherever that may be. And in a foreign trade zone, you pay your duties when your goods are sent to your customer. They leave your warehouse. So I have all my goods already here in my warehouse. Customs lets you, not customs, the law lets you, file an estimate of what you think you're going to ship to your customers over the next week. And you make it high, you don't want to go over it. You don't want to go over. So you file your estimate, they approve it, you ship all week on your estimate. At the end of your week, you pay 1 merchandise processing fee, which maxes out at $498. So instead of paying $9,960 a week, I'm only paying $498 a week. This saves me $9,462 a week, which ends up to be almost $500,000 a year, just on fees to process paperwork. And once you get this set up, it's pretty much every single one of my customers use it. It's a pretty automatic thing. You file the estimate and just get into a routine, and it's pretty easy to manage. So next slide, please. Oh, this is a good slide. With all the tariffs and all the things that have happened this year in particular, there are always considerations that you have to think about. One is quotas and safeguards. And I'm assuming, I don't know if you know what these are, but there are countervailing and anti-dumping duties that can try to protect the U.S. industry. For example, certain manufacturers, anyway. So they just have additional duties to help protect the domestic industry. So when you're looking at the items that you are importing into your foreign trade zone, are any of them subject to quotas? Are any of them subject to safeguards? That doesn't mean you can't do them in the, have that product in the Ftz. It just means you're going to have to be a little bit more mindful if it's worth it. Sometimes with quotas, I have a lot of textiles in my zone, and so, before 2006, there was quotas on all kinds of textiles. It's kind of gone away, but there's still a handful of quotas. And in the example of a textile, and in Columbus we call it fast fashion, but it's all the, the retailers, the e-commerce retailers. They're really worried about the seasonal items. And so before quotas all went away, they would bring all their stuff in to their Ftz and be ready to ship it to the store just the second the quota opened. And then they could get it out instead of waiting in a non-Ftz environment and being like, okay, well, now I can ship it over there. And it takes, 20 or 30 days to get it into the store. So that's an example. You just got to think about those kinds of things. Supply chains advantages. You can do zone-to-zone transfers. I have customers who do zone-to-zone transfers between their zone here in Columbus and maybe their zone in Reno, Nevada. Or I have customers who also do, zone-to-zone transfer between their zone and maybe they're shipping something out of Miami, so they transfer it to a zone down there to be broken down and repackaged or something. So it's very flexible in that way. You can do a lot of moving of the goods. I would say the other thing here would be the flexibility of the program. A lot of times it's compared to a bonded warehouse. And bonded warehouses are a little bit more restrictive in that, you bring things in, you get whatever you bring in, you have to send out that exact amount. In a foreign trade zone, that's not the case. I mean, not only is it quicker and it's way more flexible. You can repackage, you can relabel, you can, my stuff was on a train and there was a big train derailment, and I'm going to bring all my stuff to an Ftz and determine what I can still sell and what I have to destroy in the zone. Just all kinds of advantages you can use in a foreign trade zone. So I think some of those are intangible. You don't really know that they're going to be an advantage sometimes until something happens and you're like, oh yeah. So the last thing are sensitive items and trade remedies. I'll start with sensitive items. There are some things in zones that are sensitive, and it's basically back to the old we need to protect the U.S. domestic industry. A good example of that is the steel and aluminum industry, and they were sensitive anyway in an Ftz, and now with the additional tariffs, however, with the additional tariffs, it can be an advantage depending on your supply chain too. So raw textiles, fabric, those kinds of things, sugar. Some really weird things sometimes are there's lots of history behind some of these things. But you really need to look at your product and make sure it's not one of those sensitive items that would be really prohibited and you get turned down in an Ftz. And yeah, there are a few states, I think it's Texas, Arizona, Kentucky maybe, that have an ad valorem tax that can be abated by being in an Ftz. And in each of those states, it works a little differently. I'm familiar with this a little bit. We had this actually in Ohio until 2009, so we used to have to deal with it, and I'm really glad we don't have it anymore because it could really slow things down. But basically, personal property taxes in a zone can be abated, or real estate taxes. I think that's what Arizona is. And but you have to do some extra steps and be mindful of that, because you have to have any of the taxing jurisdictions that are affected have to, you don't have to agree, but they have to not object to your application. So next slide. Types of users. First, we'll start with the warehouse and distribution operators. This is from the Ftc Board's annual report. 2016 is the most recent year that we have available right now. 17 should be coming out soon, anytime. So these are the top 15 that were listed in the Ftc Board's report. The vehicles, now remember, this is warehouse and distribution, so this is a lot of just, I would say, storage and e-commerce on some of these things. Vehicles you see are at top of the list. Consumer electronics, oil, petroleum, textiles, footwear. You know, you can see things that you wouldn't think, I don't think. I know consumer electronics is probably a lot of cell phones, those kinds of things. Next slide. Next slide is a list of the production operators. Again, look, oil and petroleum and vehicle parts, consumer electronics, pharmaceuticals, a lot of the same products, probably because of the duty rates associated with those. Now, these are actually production. They're refining the oil. They're building the cars. You know, they're putting the cell phone kits together. They're making the pills, whatever. So this is actually the production, and a lot of that then is associated with the storage that you saw before. When you look for types of users, what the things that I look for are decent duty. You got to have a duty rate. If it's zero, it's hard to argue that you're only in there for the MPF savings, you know, the weekly entry. There has to be, you know, even deferring duties. But I look for higher duty rates, in items that maybe move slower. You know, I have iron castings, and they sit in my warehouse for 6 months. And you know, if they have a decent duty rate, why don't keep your money in your pocket? Why would you pay that and then just wait to get it back? So you just really, I think the big takeaway right here from this one, it's kind of a negative way to put it, but the FTZs are not for every company. You know, you really have to look at the customer's products, their supply chain, and just have it. They need to really have it a part of their business strategy. You know, that having been said, when it's right for somebody, it's usually really right for somebody. I don't get a lot of people who are on the fence. It's like, and the other thing is, what I found here in Columbus is once you get one, kind of look for industry clusters around. You know, and in my zone, again, textiles, once we got one, you know, we could go out and you could say, hey, this is working for other textile companies, you should look at it. And they're like, okay, well, my competitor's doing it, I better at least look at it. So, but if it worked for that one company, it might work for them all. And I've ended up getting, you know, several of them just because one company got in. So I think that wraps it up for me. Next person is Isaac.
Isaac's up next to talk about obtaining Fpz designation.
Good morning, everybody from Portland. I think I can still actually say good morning as opposed to my other friends who are a little more east of us. Definitely get into Ftz designation. I want to kind of build on what Angie said. When I was managing Ftz 45, which is the foreign trade zone for the Portland, Oregon area, the metropolitan area, covers 3 counties. Worked with companies that literally took advantage of every single benefit that Angie talked about. Portland's got a massive cluster for the athletic and outdoor wear industry. being home to Adidas North America headquarters, Nike's headquarters, Columbia Sportswear, and had a customer within the foreign trade zone that imported all that into their distribution center. And their biggest benefit was the reduction in merchandise processing fees, paying a single MPF as opposed to what in their case would have been 30 to 40 MPFs per week, depending on what point of the year they're in. Also had two manufacturing users that both benefited from duty reduction or duty elimination, depending on where their final product was headed, whether that was going to be within the US or back for re-export. And then also had a large auto importer that benefited from duty deferral. One of the biggest benefits in my mind from a foreign trade zone, obviously there is a financial benefit to the individual companies, but really what the whole program allows companies to do is to compete on a global scale. We live in a global world. Trade is part of our reality. And the truth is a lot of other companies don't have nearly the same complexity within their customs environments as we do here in the US. Without the ability to level the playing field to some of these international competitions, the companies within foreign trade zones that now have jobs and employment within the US would simply go elsewhere. Using a local example, there obviously is a very large high-tech cluster in Portland as well, being home to Intel. There's a manufacturer that builds parts that are a key component of the high-tech manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing world. They are a very large employer. They employ about 4,000 people locally, not all within the foreign trade zone. And they have other bases within the US where they have similar manufacturing plants, though at a smaller scale. And about 80% of what they manufacture here in the Portland area gets re-exported. And simply put, if they did not have access to the foreign trade zone program, if they were required to pay tariffs on the raw materials that they were bringing in to ultimately manufacture these high-tech equipments, they would not be based here. They would have moved their factory a long time ago to somewhere in Southeast Asia where they wouldn't face a similar tariff environment. So really, as an economic development tool, the foreign trade zone program helps keep US-based manufacturing competitive on a global scale. And this is extremely relevant today. In fact, I just got a notice from the Wall Street Journal about 25 minutes ago that President Trump is considering putting tariffs on an additional $267 billion worth of Chinese imports. And so this is a very, very timely topic, and I'm expecting a lot of questions around foreign trade zones and tariffs, as about 90% of the inquiries I've been handling recently have had to do with foreign trade zones with steel imports or other imports of goods that are on the Section 232 list of additional tariffs. Next slide, please, Sean. I know Sean touched on this a little bit, but I thought it'd be helpful to maybe take another look at the organization. Obviously, all the activities within the Foreign Trade Zone program come under the authority of the Foreign Trade Zone Board under the Secretary of Commerce. You have a couple different players, and the ones I really wanted to focus on today when we talk about how to set up a site are the grantee operator, and that would be essentially typically the local economic development agency that acts as the intermediary between the Foreign Trade Zones Board in DC and your local operators. And then I also wanted to touch on how to set up a foreign trade zone as an operator as well. And then I know Sean did touch on this a little bit, but I want to revisit the role that customs plays as well, just because they are a very critical player in pretty much every part of the foreign trade zone program. Next slide, please. So starting with how to establish a foreign trade zone as a grantee. As I mentioned, generally the grantee is a public agency or economic development authority. Sean would be an example of a foreign trade zone grantee as an economic development agency, and Angie would be an example of a foreign trade zone that's tied to the airport or the port of entry. A key regulation for the grantee is that they must operate as a public utility. What this means is that they have to treat all similarly situated users equally. Their fee structure must be fair, and they can't direct business either towards or away from any specific operation. There is what the Foreign Trade Zone Board refers to as the 60/90 rule. Because it deals with imported goods, foreign trade zones must be associated with a customs port of entry. A single port of entry is entitled to have at least one foreign trade zone, but may have additional if there's an economic reason to that. The 60/90 rule applies that they must be within 60 miles or 90 minutes of the customs port of entry, though there is some flexibility here in that a local customs port director may elect to serve a site that is outside of this range. Or conversely, a local port director may say that a site, even though it's within that 60/90 range, is not realistic for them to serve due to other considerations. There are two basic structures for a grantee to operate under: the ASF, or Alternative Site Framework, and the TSF, the Traditional Site Framework. The Traditional Site Framework was what was in place from the establishment of the Foreign Trade Zone Program up until the creation of the ASF program in 2011. The Traditional Site Framework basically relies on a limited number of fixed sites, and so each individual company operator was established as a specific subzone. The Alternative Site Framework is much more flexible, and a lot of credit goes to the current Ftz Board Secretary, Andrew McIlvary, for the creation of the program, but it, as an economic development tool, is much more flexible and allows a grantee to designate a service area, and the process to then establish new Ftz sites, subzones, and operators within that service area is expedited because the public notice and review process has already been gone through for the entire ASF service area. For example, here in Portland, we organized under the Alternative Site Framework in 2014, and the Alternative Site Framework covers the 3 full counties, and that now means that any company, regardless of where they're located in those 3 county area, can go through, if they're not producing goods or changing the customs codes, the HSTUS codes, can become authorized to operate within about 30 days. Next slide, please. If you are looking to establish a new zone as a grantee, you have to establish the legal authority for the zone. Specifically, you must be able to show the Ftz board that you have enabling state legislation that gives you the authority to act over this area, and that has to be reinforced through the grantee applicant's charter or a grantee resolution. As I mentioned before, every customs port is entitled to at least one Ftz. However, you must demonstrate the economic need for the proposed Ftz, and this really ties back to what I was talking about earlier about the key benefit of an Ftz being able to retain and grow jobs that compete on a global scale. You must define the service area and document support from the jurisdictions. For example, if you're looking at a county area, you have to show letters of support from the counties or the cities within that county. And tax considerations. This goes back to what Angie was talking about, the inventory or ad valorem tax. You must, in a situation where an Ftz could reduce the ability for local jurisdictions to collect taxes, you must show that you have support from the tax collecting jurisdictions for it. And there is a small filing fee. Generally, the process to establish the new ASF foreign trade zone as a grantee is about a 10-month process. Next slide, please. Some things to consider, and I believe this should be relevant to the planning audience, is compatible zoning. There are a couple things that are specifically prohibited by the Foreign Trade Zone Board as activities within any foreign trade zone site, and this includes residential and retail functions or incompatible zoning such as agricultural. This does not mean, going back to use Foreign Trade Zone 45 as an example, this does not mean that the ASF boundary doesn't include sites that are zoned for all these uses, but this really comes into play when you're obtaining a specific Ftz subzone location that's usually tied to a specific operator. And of course, you must have the confirmation letters I was talking about earlier. The Ftz sites are generally located near key transportation assets, though this is something I would say that has evolved over the past 30 to 40 years. Back when the program was put into place, customs ports were generally situated along the coastal areas or key large airports. Now you can have customs ports of entry, and you do have customs ports of entry in pretty much every state, every large airport, seaports, or logistics hubs like the Inland Empire in California. Angie is a great example of a very successful large inland foreign trade zone site. And Angie, I believe, already touched on warehousing versus manufacturing users, but obviously the zoning has to support the use that's being proposed within the foreign trade zone site. Next slide, please. So coming back to the CBP role, just because of how important it is, you essentially have this conduit from operator to grantee to foreign trade zone that establishes the authority to operate the foreign trade zone or the specific operations. But throughout all of this, CBP, the Customs and Border Patrol, is responsible for the enforcement and day-to-day monitoring of activity. What this means is that CBP must be consulted on every application for the zone or every new proposal for operations or activity within a new subzone site as an operator. Movement of all goods is reported to the CBP. This is typically done through your CBP forms and their automated customs system. And at any time, all goods within the zone and all zone records are subject to spot checks and verifications at any time. Really coming back to the importance of a good relationship between whether it be the grantee and the customs officer or the operator and the customs officer. And when we get together at industry conferences, the importance of a good relationship with customs is continually reinforced. Next slide, please. So starting to look at how to establish an FTZ site as an operator, the first step is definitely to contact the local grantee. The local grantee is going to be not just a conduit, but also the resource. Most grantees, and all three of us on this call, will do high-level cost-benefit analysis for any proposed new operator. As Sean mentioned, there is considerable cost that goes along with the inventory controls required for a foreign trade zone, but those are generally offset. And so that initial cost-benefit analysis can help you determine if it's worth pursuing further. If there is a benefit, go through the application process, determine if you are distribution or production. Production, again, relies on whether you are changing the HTS code associated with what's imported into the zone versus what goes out of the zone. And then the last process, once you get concurrence or approval from the Ftz board, is activation through the US Customs and Border Protection. Next slide, please. There are two types of designation. You can have the alternative site framework and the traditional site framework. I've chosen to focus on the alternative site framework because really over time, the traditional site framework is slowly going away given the enhanced flexibility of the ASF framework. Within the ASF as a grantee, you can designate a magnet site, and this is an area that retains Ftz designation and can be used as a way to drive economic growth to a specific area. For example, within Ftz 45, the entire Rivergate Industrial District, which is by our marine ports, is designated as a magnet site. Within the magnet site or within anywhere within the ASF area, you can designate a usage-driven site or a subzone. This typically is associated with an operator. Think the company that actually sets up the foreign trade zone, does manufacturing, does distribution. So the distribution centers I talked about for the athletic and outdoor wear company is a subzone. The manufacturing sites, multiple buildings, 6 of them are subzones for the manufacturing user that in the high-tech sector. And then there is also the ability to designate a subzone that's actually technically under the TSF framework if you have a company that wants to be under your FTZ that is outside of your alternative site framework. Going back to another local example, the ASF covers the Portland metro area. There's another smaller metro area about 30 minutes south of Portland. If a company there wanted to actually take advantage of the foreign trade zone, if Customs concurred with their ability to effectively monitor and oversee that operations. As the grantee, you could apply to have a TSF subzone for them, given that they're outside your established ASF service area. Next slide, please. So kind of just revisiting how to establish a new alternative site framework subzone. This is just one of many processes for activation, but this is by far the most common, the ASF subzone process. The application is submitted by the grantee. Application is very straightforward, can be found on the Ftc Board website. Generally, depending on the extent of the company's operations, can be anywhere from 4 to 8 pages. Covers site information, summary of activity, map of locations, includes either before or afterwards concurrence from Customs and Border Protection, and if applicable, the letters about the tax impact. There is no Ftc board fee. Generally, if you're not a production company, if you're not manipulating the HTS codes, there is no public comment, and it's about a 30-day time period for Ftc board approval. Things to keep in mind generally is that the grantee is a big resource and promoter and should be viewed as an ally throughout this process, not just a regulatory body. However, the grantee may require an agreement between the company and grantee formalizing their relationship, and the grantee may have separate fees associated with the application and activation process. Next slide, please. And I know the three of us covered a lot of information, but there are some really helpful resources out on the web. Probably the best place to start is actually the U.S. Foreign Trade Zones Board's own website. And I would also encourage everybody to look at the Customs and Border Protection website, specifically the Ftz manual. This gives great guidance on what CBP is looking for in the establishment of either a new subzone or a new foreign trade zone period. And as mentioned a couple times, CBP concurrence is critical for everything that gets done within the foreign trade zone program. So making sure they're happy is key. There is one large industry group, the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones. All three of us are members, and the information gathered from the organization through webinars, through their committees, and through their spring and annual conferences is invaluable. And then, of course, your local FTZ and a map of all active foreign trade zones can be found on the Foreign Trade Zones Board website. And lastly, and probably the absolute best resource, next slide, Sean, would be the three of us. And I'll turn it back to Sean, but you see all our contact information, and would love to hear more from you either in the questions as part of this or directly afterwards.
Great, Isaac. Thanks so much. Thanks, Angie. I really appreciate your help and your contribution here. You each had a unique perspective that really added value to this. And as Isaac mentioned, we've got a slide up here with our contact information. All three of us, I'm going to speak for all three of us, and I'll pay for it at the annual conference if I'm wrong. But I think that we're all here to help you navigate foreign trade zones and what they mean. You can also connect with me. My Twitter handle is @CDRPC_Sean. I'm also on LinkedIn. You find me a lot of different places. I've also posted that up there. I do tend to post some information about foreign trade zones and trade issues as they pop up along the way. So with that, I guess, we'll open it up to any questions that are out there.
Great, thank you. Again, folks, just type those questions in the chat box and don't forget to label who you'd like to answer the questions. First one is for Angie. The question is, please define reputable importer, which you mentioned when you were talking about Saturday imports.
Well, as with anything, you get a reputation with customs on, the way you import your goods. So some companies most companies, let me just say that, most companies have a good reputation with U.S. Customs. But, there are some that don't, or maybe they're getting something from somewhere that isn't going to be approved. So maybe they're getting stuff from Afghanistan, or I don't know. But I mean, they have to live up to the standards. That's what I meant. In an FTZ, just to add a little bit more to that, there are a lot of companies, almost every company imports nowadays. So customs has a lot of things on their hand. But in an FTZ, the customs port you are dealing with is your local customs port, not the one out in LA where your goods came in, but your customs port right in your backyard. And so you have and through the whole security process in the FTZ, if you were doing FTZ, you would be very familiar with the FTZ officer. And in my zone, in 138 here, they email him directly and he responds. All of my operators have a great relationship with the FTZ officer. And so once you're in the zone and you've been vetted and scrutinized and you are reputable according to customs, the inspections and those kinds of things, they're more familiar with you, so they kind of goes down. They're more comfortable. They know what you're doing. So anyway, that's long answer to a short question.
Okay, thank you. Well, we still have you. Does the expense of the $498 fee come from the pocket of the shipper, who is losing money with the FTZ limit of $498 when doing the shipping estimate?
U.S. Customs.
Okay.
So the shipper pays that fee to U.S. Customs to process their paperwork. So when the fee is reduced to the one a week, it comes out of the U.S. Treasury. However, there's a paperwork reduction, and it's less work in the long run for U.S. Customs too. So, yeah, you have to weigh that. That's why we don't really want people just getting it for the weekly entry. There has to be some kind of business besides that advantage to being in the zone, because we just don't want to do that to take money from U.S. Customs, and U.S. Treasury. So, yeah, it is definitely, it is a fee that the shipper would pay that they do not have to pay. Shipper saves, Customs pays. So,
I think from the viewpoint of a grantee, the one thing, that we're looking for is our businesses to, contribute jobs and investment too. And that's, I think part of utilizing the program, like Angie said, just using the program to benefit from a merchandise processing fee reduction on paperwork without any other substantial benefit to the community probably isn't in the objectives of most, and probably all grantees.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if we could talk a little bit about what a community profile kind of looks like for an FTZ, as in who's typically doing them? Are we talking large cities, multi-county regions, just communities? What does this profile look like for the average FTZ?
I think, the three of us all represent different profiles from, Portland, a major coastal city, to what Angie does. What is it, Angie? America's largest inland port?
I don't know. We're changing our name too, so yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely an inland port. Yeah.
Yeah, and then to what we are, we're 3 hours north of the port of New York, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
So it varies. It really depends, I think, what the business makeup is in the community and what they're able to utilize. There's certainly advantages to being located in areas with significant transportation infrastructure. I think rail, air, road, sea, that all comes into play. I'll say in Albany, having the port along the Hudson River, having CP rail, and other lines that come through here, having the presence of the Albany International Airport, as well as the intersection of Interstates 1987, puts us at an advantageous position, also being situated 3 hours north or 2.5 hours north of New York City and 3 hours south of the Canadian border, 2.5, 3 hours to Boston, we find ourselves in an advantageous position.
And
I would add that each community can do it however suits them, wherever the support is. I would say, the grantee is normally the economic development entity in the community. That's not really the case here in Columbus when you look at it as the airport authority, but if you really look a little closer, I'm not at the passenger airport. I'm at a cargo airport with 75 million square feet of industrial parks around me. So it's more of an economic development catalyst down here at this airport. I think that's wherever the support in your community lies for the economic development entity, whoever that leader is. I think that usually is where the grant of authority is, but each community can do it however they like.
Yeah, and just kind of build on what Angie said. I mean, there's an entity in Texas that is a private, very large industrial multi-use development, and they have an FTZ grant of authority. You see a number of airports, especially cargo airports, having FTZ grant authorities. Work extensively with a small city on the south coast of Oregon that they're considering being a foreign trade zone site, simply based on a large manufacturer timber activity that they have. And so really the community profile for who's the grantee varies from small public entities to large public entities to private entities to port authorities to seaports to cities to private economic development agencies that represent cities. And then on the operator side, it's even more diverse. You can have third-party logistics providers be operators to simply provide a benefit within one of their what they call general purpose warehouses to individual companies.
Okay, thanks. Next one. Isaac, you're up. You said that establishing a new FTZ has to be fair and not favor one importer over another. So what is the political influence, if any? And is it a local, state, or federal influence? It seems that fairness can be based on a political stand.
Absolutely, and definitely that fairness comes into play when you're going through any sort of application or activation process. And so it does have to come essentially at all levels, where you get the local support as well as the federal support. Giving a couple of examples, the first area where fairness generally comes into play is when the grantee establishes their fees. You can't treat two different entities that are essentially performing the same function, and under that large umbrella, call it distribution function. You can't charge one a fee that is viewed separately from the other, and they'll essentially raise a complaint to the governing agency, in this case the Foreign Trade Zone Board, about the applicability of your fees. And the Foreign Trade Zone Board actually about 2 years ago beefed up and specifically hired auditors to go around the country and start auditing fee structures, zone schedules that different grantees have. So that's one aspect of the fairness. Another aspect of the fairness comes into, and the political considerations comes into actually the specific activity going on. We have an operator within Foreign Trade Zone 45 that imports plastic and inks and ultimately manufactures printer cartridges. In going through that activation process, we came to realize that there is a very active lobbying for the domestic ink production industry. And so the aspect of fairness on a federal scale came into play, and it was an extensive public comment period, long evaluation by the Foreign Trade Zone Board, and really a fairly nuanced discussion as to the economic benefit that would be provided to the local region through the establishment of the Foreign Trade Zone that essentially allowed those inks to be imported and manufactured here versus the impact on a national level to the constituents of the ink lobby. So there is that aspect of fairness when it comes to not just the fee structure, but also the specific activity taking place and the benefit or burden to the domestic industry that already exists within that. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. Real quick, hey, Sean, could you please go back to the screen with the website information? There's a couple of people that are. Yep, thanks. Just leave that on there for a minute so people can jot those down. And again, folks, we will have a PDF of this presentation available, and we'll also have a recording of this. So if you still miss it or, you know, whatever, we have it available for you. Okay, great, thanks. Next question. Can the Ftz zone program be abused or played? What are the pitfalls to avoid this?
I'm happy
I'll go ahead, Isaac.
Okay, I can give an example. I would say to start that there's a number of protections in place to make sure that the program doesn't be abused. And I can give an example of where that came into play. Locally, we had a inquiry into the establishment of a foreign trade zone for a gentleman or a company that wanted to import tobacco and then roll cigars. And essentially they were looking at it once it was investigated by us as the grantee and with concurrence from the board. It essentially was they were looking for a way to circumvent labor protections and restrictions on the import of goods from Cuba. And that very quickly was flushed out. And there was, once it was identified, there was additional follow-up outside of the foreign trade zones board or the grantee into the legality of that operation. So I think that that's an example of how the systems functions to make sure it wasn't abused.
You know, in my perspective on this, you know, having run an enterprise zone, you know, in New York State, the Empire Zone program got criticized for what were abuses of the program, I guess. You know, the foreign trade zone, you know, isn't fronting any money. You know, any of the benefits are deferred revenues at best. You know, I think the level of security and scrutiny that Customs and Border Protection has in place really preserves the integrity of the program, both programmatically and fiscally, to the U.S. Treasury. You know, any operators, users have to carry a bond, and their bond has to be established for the estimated value, a figure that is developed by you know, Customs and Border Protection for the duties that would be owed. So if things are brought into a foreign trade zone and then the inventory is wiped out overnight, nobody knows where it went to, you know, that responsibility is still there to pay the United States for those duties that were owed. You know, and I can, you know, from our perspective here, we've never run into it. Again, I think there's nothing probably more convincing than an armed customs agent coming into your facility to do a walkthrough that you're going to have some level of compliance.
Sean, or everyone, yeah, this is Angie. I haven't had any experience with anybody trying to play the Ftz, and if they did, I would immediately take their side away from them. You know, you can't get that bad reputation with the Ftz board or with your community. So that's important to me as the grantee to treat everybody fairly. And then, yeah, I haven't heard of anybody playing. In fact, you know, since this webinar is about the Trump tariffs also, in every one of those sections that Sean was talking about at the beginning, 232, 201, 301, every single one of those additional tariffs have to, in a foreign trade zone, have to be entered in what they call privileged foreign status, those products, which means that locks in that duty rate. And so it's not like you can avoid those duties by being in a foreign trade zone. If you end up sending those to your U.S. customers, you're still going to have to pay those duties, period. So because they are those safeguards, you know. Now, if you re-export out of a zone, you don't have to because it never enters the stream of commerce, U.S. stream of commerce. But, you know, if you're doing just U.S. business, you know, you can't get around even those additional tariffs. So,
you know, and to build on some of the specificity of the Trade Act actions. Angie mentioned earlier one of the benefits or one of the actions that an importer exporter may use is duty drawback. And the foreign trade zone offers a benefit to avoid paying duties and tariffs on those items that are subject to those trade actions. And I believe on all of them, duty drawback is eliminated as a benefit. And so, we probably should have hit on that. I should have hit on that as to why the foreign trade zone matters in this environment. It's not, as Angie said, the privileged foreign status is going to lock in your duty rate the minute you brought it in. So if those car radios were subject to the trade actions under those acts of 62 or 74, that 5.5% tariff rate is going to be locked in. But if that car, is exported, then that duty rate is never paid. If that car is imported, then the higher duty rate is going to apply. And on to the, and back to the abuse. And Angie said this, that, she wouldn't let it happen. Users have to enter in agreements with grantees for use of the foreign trade zone. There's a lot of stipulations in there. And one of those, generally is that you'll use the zone properly. Otherwise, the grant of the foreign trade zone status can be removed. There's provisions, I know there's provisions on our agreements with our operator users to terminate the foreign trade zone designation.
Okay, thank you. Next question, and this is for anyone. Are you seeing an increased interest in participating in FTZs based on the rise of e-commerce and just-in-time customer delivery expectations?
I'm happy to start with this one, and I would definitely say the answer to that is yes. A lot of the distribution and warehousing is moving to being much more e-commerce based, and as companies look to essentially ship from their distribution directly to consumers, the amount of time and inventory for goods that are being imported goes up slightly at the distribution because it's not ultimately going to a wholesaler or retailer that quickly. And with the increased time that it spends in distribution, there's an increased potential for duty deferral to present enough of a benefit to establish a foreign trade zone site. Again, using the athletic and outdoor wear example locally, their distribution site was essentially just a wholesale distribution site and is now evolving to an e-commerce and wholesale distribution site. And as part of that, the extent of the foreign trade zone within their distribution area is expanding to include their e-commerce site. We're also seeing here in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, consolidation of the e-commerce distribution sites, more companies choosing to serve e-commerce in especially Canada, the Vancouver, Alberta, Calgary markets from a single distribution center. And so there's obviously a foreign trade zone duty elimination benefit for the goods that are imported that then ultimately re-exported at direct-to-consumer e-commerce packages for the Canadian market.
I would echo that. That's what my zone is. I've said this several times. Textiles. Think of all the big, not all of them, but the big stores. Where you can buy your clothes. They're coming through this zone, and they're supplying stores out of their DCs, but they're also doing e-commerce. And this is Columbus. We're booming like a lot of other communities right now. And our customs office I shouldn't probably be saying this out loud, is very, very concerned about the rate of increase of e-commerce here. And it's see if they could keep up with it. They're still tasked with controlling that, whether it's in the zone or not. And it's very, very, e-commerce is huge right now. And I would echo the Canadian thing too. I've had several companies shut down an expensive Canadian warehouse and do their e-commerce to at least the eastern half of Canada from here. You can truck it right over the border in less than a day and put it in the Canadian Postal Service. And it's very, very quick and efficient. So, yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Can you give us examples of operators and users? It is hard to tell the difference.
I only have operator users here, so my companies that are using it are playing both roles. So I'll defer to others.
I have all operator users except one, and it is a 3PL, third-party logistics firm. The XLs, the Gencos, the Penske's, they run the warehouses for everybody. That's what they do. So they'll lease the warehouse, and it'll be their employees, but it's got Company A's products in there, or more than multiple companies' products in their operation. So I have one like that, and so the company, the 3PL, is the operator, and the company underneath, Company A, is the user. So the user is getting the benefit, but I'm sure that the 3PL is making some money because they're running that warehouse and doing all their Ftz stuff. So, yeah.
And I just have one example where the operator and user are different, and that is there's a company that's made their business in being the operator for auto imports, exports through foreign trade zones along the West Coast. They're an operator here in Portland, and the user is actually the car manufacturer that's moving it through them, but the operator is responsible for the foreign trade zone site, the inventory controls, etc. And very similar to Angie's example, the operator is doing it given their specialization, understanding of foreign trade zones requirements and inventory controls, but they're obviously getting a financial benefit or sharing the financial benefit of the foreign trade zone with the user.
Okay, I think we're going to pause and stop. It is 2:30. So thanks to all of you, to Sean, Isaac, and Angie, for joining us today. And everyone, be sure to log your CM credits. They're up, posted, ready to go. And we'll have a PDF of the presentation available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And we'll have a presentation recording available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. All right, everyone, again, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And thanks to the Economic Development Division for hosting today's session. And everyone, we will talk next time. Have a great weekend.